While the cooler on this video card hints at an ASUS product, the PCB underneath is a Gigabyte R9270, both as defective and without the cooler. But will its game performance be worth the effort of repairing it? A first hint for that can be seen in the GPU-Z window seen on screen right now. This card uses the full-sized bit-kern GPU, so right off the bat we know it should run better than the R7265 reviewed a few weeks earlier. The slight overclock of 50 MHz should give it a leg up also against the reference design variant of the R9270 that we examined a year ago. The card has a rated TDP of 150 watts. Now, I can't comment about the WindForce cooling solution that Gigabyte would normally pair its board with, but I can say that I'm not that happy with what ASUS provided. The two heat pipes, the fin stack and the two fans are nice and all, but the gap in between the two heat pipes is hardly something to be proud of. Never mind the fact that the memory chips and the VRMs were left to their own devices. Still, despite my complaints, the card did not warm up higher than 67C in heaven for a delta over ambient of 44C. The more aggressive fan curve that I set from MSI Afterburner drops that by 10 degrees, so I guess I'm cool with the results. As with some of the other cards previously reviewed, some of the games will be platform constrained at the low settings I typically test at, and the honor of being the bottleneck is awarded to the Z230 workstation sporting the same i7-4770 equivalent Xeon and the same 32GB of DDR3 RAM running at 1600 MHz in dual channel. Time for some game results, and the first batch is from Rainbow Six Siege. The game was tested at low settings, 2 resolutions, 1080 and 720, and 2 rendering scales, 150% respectively. My suggestion is go for the combination that gets the 1% lows at around 60 FPS or better. This rules out the full scale 1080, but the 50% render scale option is doable. Here the average is in the mid-80s and the 1% lows is 60 FPS. 720 resolution runs well on both rendering scale, but I stick to 100% since both the average of 107 and the 1% lows of 70 should be just fine. Doom Eternal runs just as glitzy and sparkly on the R9270 as on the R7265. The problem, like with all GCN1 cards, is that it starts with artifacts that look like both the Doom guy and all the demons accidentally got glitter on them and tried to get rid of it by rubbing against each and every wall. Then soon enough it all turns into a disco light show that is bound to cause seizures. Unfortunately, this means no Doom Eternal on this card. Having tested some presets with the previous card, I had a pretty good idea of how the R9270 would perform in Fallout 4. At 1080 resolution and ultra settings, the card averaged 36 FPS and provided 1% lows of 33. This latter metric becomes a bit worse in areas with a lot of vegetation, so 1080 resolution and high settings would be a good alternative. The average FPS now gets close to 40 and the 1% lows remains in the mid-30s, both in Diamond City and outside of it. Or stick to ultra but drop the resolution to 1600 by 900. Your call. Apex Legends is actually in the playable range of FPS at 1080 resolution and low settings, and while both the average of 84 FPS and the 1% lows of 59 are fine, dropping the resolution to 1600 by 900 gets the average above 100 and the 1% lows at 70. This is a good compromise between resolution and performance, in my opinion. But if you're fine dropping the resolution even more, 720 will get those metrics to 125 and 83 FPS respectively. The R9270 ran a bit better than the GTX 760 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. While the latter required a drop in resolution to run the game at low settings, the bit-kern GPU averaged 47 FPS and got a 1% loss of 30 at 1080 resolution. The 1600 by 900 resolution that the Nvidia card needed allowed the Radeon to run the game at medium settings compared to the low preset used by the Kepler card, and still provided an acceptable single-player experience. The results for Counter-Strike 2 will surprise no one. Because of the same system bottleneck that was noticeable for a few videos now, the average results are pretty much the same for all three tested resolutions, around 120 FPS. The 1% lows were a bit better at 1080 resolution, going close to 100. Lowering the resolution does not increase the average by more than a few percentages, but definitely harms the 1% lows. Classic system bottleneck. Unlike Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Borderlands 3 ran a bit slower on the Radeon R9 270 compared to the GTX 760. The AMD card provides playable frame rates at 1080 resolution, but only when using either the very low or the low preset. The average FPS is 53 for the former and 46 for the latter, while the 1% lows is 41 and 32 respectively. And while the Radeon managed the game fairly at 1600 by 900 and medium settings, it failed to deliver a playable experience at 720 resolution and high settings. According to the training map, XDefiant will run well at low settings even at 1080 resolution with averages in the low 90s and 1% lows in the low 60s. Matches will provide less reproducible and lower results, so my advice is to stick to either 1600 by 900 or 720 resolutions. Averages are around 120 and 154 FPS respectively, and the 1% lows get close to 80 and 85 FPS. Resident Evil 4 is a rough experience at 720 resolution and lower settings. No upscaling was used, and while the average of 43 FPS sounds fine, the 1% loss of 23 does not. Now, the game is a slow-paced single-player title, and some players, me included, can stomach the experience. Not everybody will though. Despite being placed closer to the end of the list of games that I test GPUs with, Fortnite is actually the first title that I collect data for. The behavior on the main map is quite similar to that of the other cards, where the average FPS increases rather slowly with the decrease in pixel count, but the 1% low stays the same. The game was tested in performance mode and with the rendering distance set to far, and the averages are in between 113 at 1080 resolution and 148 at 720. The 1% lows are anywhere in between mid-60s and mid-70s. The reload map, however, is smaller, and quite a good number of video cards end up being CPU bottlenecked, especially when running in performance mode. In the case of the R9 270, we hit the limit of the CPU of around 220 FPS for the average. The 1% lows become worse as the average FPS gets closer to the limits of the platform, dropping from 103 FPS at 1080 to 88 FPS at 720 resolution. You should probably ignore the data collected for Terminator resistance at the low settings preset. Just like the previously reviewed card, the R9 270 can run the game quite well at high settings, with an average FPS of 49 and the 1% loss of 35. This one seems fairly easy to run, even on a 12 years old GPU like Bitcoin. The FPS in Overwatch 2 scales almost linearly with the drop in resolution. This game runs GPU bottlenecked at low settings and no anti-aliasing. 1080 resolution will run perfectly fine with an average close to 150 and 1% loss close to 120. At the bottom of the resolution, you'd get the highest FPS at 284 for the average and 232 for the 1% lows. Dota 2 runs well at 1080 resolution and low settings. The rendering skill was manually set back to 100%. As for the FPS, take them with a grain of salt. Lower performing GPUs can report higher numbers, so considering the 91 FPS average and 51 FPS for the 1% lows as just numbers. The R9 270 runs Control quite well at the low settings. 1080 resolution will have the card averaging in the low 50s and provide 1% lows in the low 40s. 720 resolution will raise these two metrics to 99 and 75 FPS respectively. The card has some performance overhead at lower resolutions, so feel free to experiment with the quality options at either 1600 by 900 or 1280 by 720 resolutions. Unlike with the previously reviewed card, if you play GTA 5 you should settle for the settings suggested by the game. To have a like-for-like comparison, however, I ran the benchmark at 1080 resolution and low settings. The card averaged 121 FPS and had the 1% lows in the high 60s. So, just use the settings suggested by the game and you should get a better balance between visuals and performance. The same can be said for Warframe, especially since the 1080 resolution and low settings that I use proved to be too easy for the Pitcairn power card. The average FPS stayed above 200 FPS and the 1% lows remained north of 120. This is a PvE title, so you can afford increasing the quality settings even if that halves your performance metrics. The card was bought as defective and came without a heatsink, in a bundle with the GeForce 8500, also defective. The heatsink came from, fun enough, another Pitcairn power card, an ASUS R9 270X, that came in DOA with short circuits on the GPU power rail, memory controller and PEX rails. After repairing the Gigabyte board using MOSFETs and capacitors from the ASUS board, the DirectCU cooler seemed the obvious choice to get a functioning card. And after making sure that it fits both mechanically and electrically, Well, the Gigasus was born. And while this was a fun process for me, buying one used but in a functioning state won't break the bank. Either the 270 or the 270X can be found quite frequently for 30 USD, sometimes less. A better deal if you ask me than the GT1030s I keep running into. Drivers might be an issue though. Pretty much all R9 270s out there will get the 182 error code when trying to install the very latest legacy driver, the Adrenaline 22.6.1. Previous drivers, however, like the Adrenaline 21.5.1 will detect the card and install just fine. There are a few more 2GB cards to check out in the near future. If you like this kind of video, well, you know what to do. The Gigasus will remain in my collection indefinitely. I like this Franken card, and as you could tell already, we're done with this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the